I wasn't supposed to be at the wedding. That's what my daughter said as she stood in her $1,000 gown, staring at me like I was a stranger. Mom, this is not the place for you. Please, leave. I had spent 28 years raising her alone, after her father died, after I gave up everything I ever wanted, just to make sure she never went without. And now, in front of 200 guests and the man she was marrying into wealth, she looked through me like I was invisible. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I placed the gift on the table I had paid for, beneath the chandelier I had paid for, inside the venue I had paid for, and then I walked away. That was the last moment of her perfect wedding. What came next wasn't revenge, it was justice. And it started with one quiet phone call from a mother who had finally had enough. Margaret Holloway never planned to grow old alone. At 67, her house in Spokane echoed with silence, the kind that creeps in when a life once filled with laughter turns into long evenings of remembering. Widowed young, she had spent the past 3 decades raising her only daughter, Grace, with a level of devotion that most would call obsessive, though she called it motherhood. Once Margaret was a promising law student at the University of Washington, top of her class, destined for courtrooms, landmark cases, a nameplate on a heavy mahogany desk. But all that changed the day her husband, Walter, collapsed at the construction site where he worked. An undiagnosed heart condition, the doctors had said. One moment she was a student, a wife, a woman with a future, and the next she was a widow with a 6-month-old baby, a mortgage, and no backup plan. Margaret made her first sacrifice the following morning. She dropped out of law school, boxed up her textbooks, and never looked back. I'll go back someday, she told herself, even as she knew she wouldn't. Reality didn't allow space for ambition anymore, not when there were formula cans to buy and heating bills to cover. She sold the land her grandparents had left her, a small patch of wooded acreage near the lake, just enough to keep the house and buy herself time to think. That time vanished quickly. She cleaned houses. She worked nights at a local diner, mornings at the community library. Every job paid just enough to survive. When she couldn't afford childcare, she brought Grace with her, swaddled in secondhand blankets behind the front desk or tucked under the counter in a bassinet that reeked faintly of bleach. Other women pitied her. Some praised her strength. She ignored them all. Margaret didn't want sympathy. She wanted stability. Grace became her world, her reason, her anchor. When Grace was 3, Margaret started reading business books in secret, checking them out from the library after her shift ended. Books on budgeting, credit, investments. At night, when Grace slept, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, under the hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb, learning how to stretch every penny. Not to get rich, she had no illusions about wealth, but to make sure her daughter never felt poor. By the time Grace turned 5, Margaret had saved enough to move them into a slightly better part of town. A duplex with peeling paint but working plumbing and neighbors who smiled. Grace called it our castle, and Margaret pretended it was true. She learned to braid Grace's hair, to sew her school clothes, to pack lunches that looked like everyone else's. She skipped dentist appointments for herself to pay for art supplies when Grace discovered watercolors. She turned down dinner invitations, new shoes, 1,000 little comforts, always choosing her daughter first. Her sacrifice was invisible by design. Every report card went on the fridge like a trophy. Every dance recital, Margaret sat front row, clapping louder than anyone else. She never let Grace see the exhaustion, the bank notices, the unpaid overtime. She wore pride like armor, pretending it was enough. Grace never asked about her mother's past, never questioned why Margaret never remarried, or why they never went on vacation like other families, and Margaret never offered an answer. Her daughter's world was one she had carefully built, brick by brick, from her own broken dreams. People sometimes asked why Margaret didn't date again. She'd smile and say, "I already have everything I need." But the truth was more complicated. She'd been in love once, deeply, and losing Walter had shattered something so completely that she couldn't imagine risking that pain again. Besides, love required time. energy, both of which she had already given to someone else. She remembered one evening in particular. Grace was 10, sick with the flu, burning with fever. Margaret sat by her side all night, a cold rag pressed to her daughter's forehead, whispering lullabies between prayers. She promised herself that night, if I can just keep her safe, I'll be okay. I don't need anything else. And she meant it. Margaret watched her friends take vacations, buy nicer homes, retire early. She stayed behind, always behind, the unspoken cost of devotion etched into the lines on her face and the calluses on her hands. But she never regretted it. At least, not then. Back then, every sacrifice felt like a seed planted, an investment in a future where her daughter would thrive, succeed, and maybe, just maybe, turn around one day and say, "Thanks, Mom." She waited 28 years for that moment. It never came. There were things Margaret never told anyone, not even the closest of friends, the kind who called on Christmas and remembered her birthday. Some secrets weren't born from shame, but from love, the kind that protects even when it hurts. One of those secrets lived in a worn shoebox beneath her bed, hidden under old blankets, surrounded by silence. Grace was 18 when it happened. Her first year of college, her first real relationship, her first devastating mistake. The call had come late, midnight on a Thursday. Grace's voice was trembling, breathless, not quite crying yet. "Mom, I messed up." Margaret didn't ask questions. She got in her car, drove 6 hours through snow and fatigue, and picked her daughter up outside a clinic with no sign and no judgment. Grace couldn't even look her in the eye. She didn't have to. Margaret held her like she was still 5 years old, scraped knees and all. They never spoke of it again. Margaret handled the paperwork. She signed forms, paid fees, brought soup, and washed blood-stained sheets in a laundromat 2 towns over so Grace wouldn't have to carry the weight of her mistake any longer than necessary. She told no one, not the pastor, not the family doctor, not even Grace's father's sister, who asked questions far too often. Protecting her daughter's reputation meant erasing her own opinion. Margaret had been raised Catholic, but love to her was louder than doctrine. She buried the experience in that shoebox, along with the ultrasound photo the clinic had mistakenly handed her. She didn't throw it away. She couldn't. It was a reminder of how fiercely she could love, even when it tore her apart. Years later, Margaret would sit across from a kind man named Tom Barrett, widowed, gentle, fond of literature and long walks. He met her through a mutual friend at the library. They went out for tea once a week, then dinner. He held doors open, remembered her favorite poem, even asked if he could call her Maggie. Tom proposed after 9 months. A quiet ring, a trembling voice, a promise of companionship. Margaret said no. She didn't explain, didn't cry, just pressed her palm to his and whispered, "I'm still raising someone." Grace was 22 at the time, busy with internships and grad school. But Margaret feared how her daughter would feel, seeing her mother happy, seeing another man in the picture. The closeness between them had always been delicate. She didn't want to upset the balance. Tom understood. That was what made it worse. He left with Grace, no pun intended, and never looked back. Margaret stayed alone, not because she wanted to be, but because love, again, meant sacrifice. On days when loneliness felt like a second skin, she would pull out that shoebox and read the one thing that kept her steady. It was a letter, folded and refolded 100 times, the ink smudged, the paper soft from age. Grace had written it at 15 for a school assignment she never turned in. "Dear Mom, you are the strongest person I know. I don't tell you enough, but I see everything you do. I see how tired your hands look when you think I'm not watching. I see how you skip meals so I can have extra. I see how your eyes light up when I'm happy and how they dim when I'm not. I know you gave up your dreams for mine. One day I'll make you proud. One day I'll give you everything back. I love you. Grace." Margaret kept that letter like a relic, a belief, proof that somewhere, beneath the teenage rebellion, the adult distance, and eventually the cold silences, her daughter had once known, had once seen her, loved her. She never showed it to anyone, not even Grace. To Margaret, that letter wasn't something to hold over her daughter's head. It was her private talisman, her maybe someday. A tiny seed of hope that everything she had done wasn't invisible. Whenever the loneliness grew too heavy or the sacrifices felt too big, she read that letter. She remembered the girl who wrote it. The girl who once wore pigtails and ran into her arms after school, whose smile could undo every ache. She told herself that girl was still in there somewhere, that one day Grace would remember. One day she would come home, not just to the house on Elm Street, but to the truth of what their bond had once meant. Margaret had never wanted a parade, never asked for applause. She didn't want a statue or her name etched in gold. She just wanted her daughter to see her again. Really see her. The chapel was breathtaking. Arched windows drenched in golden light, white roses lining the aisle like a dream plucked from the pages of a magazine. Every detail whispered wealth, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, string quartet, playing Bach as guests in designer gowns sipped champagne. Margaret stood at the back, a figure out of place. Her dress was a soft blue, vintage and worn, the same one she had worn to her cousin's wedding 10 years prior. She had brushed her silver hair into a neat bun and polished her shoes until the scuffs were less visible, but no amount of care could hide the fact that she didn't belong. And yet, her eyes sparkled. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from pride. She clutched a small gift box wrapped in white and gold paper, tied with a ribbon she'd saved from last Christmas. Inside was a locket engraved with Grace's initials. Inside that, a photo of Grace as a baby. Her smile in that picture had carried Margaret through years of loneliness. She had arrived early, thinking maybe she could find a quiet seat in the back. No need for fanfare, no expectations. She wasn't even sure if Grace knew she was coming, but she hoped. Surely her daughter would smile when she saw her, but Grace didn't smile. She froze. Margaret saw it happen. The moment Grace's eyes found her. She was standing near the altar, surrounded by bridesmaids in pale rose dresses, laughing at something the photographer had said. And then she looked up, and the laughter died. The room seemed to pause, the music floating on as Grace's face hardened. Margaret raised her hand in a gentle wave. Grace stepped forward, her heels tapping quickly against the marble. Her bouquet trembled slightly. Guests turned, subtly sensing tension. "Mom," Grace said, her voice low but urgent. What are you doing here?" Margaret blinked. I came to see you get married. I thought maybe..." "You're not on the guest list," Grace interrupted. Her voice wasn't angry. It was controlled, almost rehearsed. "This is a private ceremony." The words stung more than if Grace had shouted. Margaret tried to smile to soften the moment. "Sweetheart, I don't need to sit up front. I'll stay in the back, quiet. I just wanted to see you." Henry appeared then. Tall, clean-shaven, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly mortgage. His eyes were already sharp, judgmental. "What's going on?" he asked Grace, placing a protective arm around her. "This is my mother," Grace said quickly. "She just showed up. I didn't invite her." Henry's gaze slid to Margaret, appraising her like a contractor evaluating cheap materials. "I see," he said coolly. "Mrs. Holloway, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Margaret felt the box in her hand growing heavier. "There's no misunderstanding," she said, her voice gentle. "I raised this girl. I paid for this wedding. Every flower, every flute of champagne, this very venue. I just wanted to see her happy." Henry's jaw clenched. "Money doesn't entitle you to presents. This is a curated guest list. People here, they notice things. Appearances matter." "Henry," Grace said, lightly squeezing his arm. We don't want to make a scene. Please, Mom, just go. It's better for everyone. The phrase better for everyone echoed in Margaret's ears, a phrase used to justify erasure, a phrase that hid cowardice behind courtesy. I see, Margaret said softly. The gift box in her hand now felt like a stone. She set it gently on a nearby table between two champagne flutes and a vase of orchids she had helped pay for. I won't stay where I'm not wanted. She turned to go. Her steps were steady, her spine straight. But inside, something splintered. The chatter behind her resumed, low and awkward. Someone laughed too loudly. The music never stopped. Margaret reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped into the late afternoon sun. Behind her, her daughter's perfect wedding unfolded without her. Outside, the spring wind tugged gently at Margaret's dress, carrying the scent of white orchids. Orchids she had personally approved from the florist's catalog 6 months earlier. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, but inside her chest, a storm brewed so loud it made her ears ring. The door closed behind her with a soft but final click, sealing her out like an unwanted memory. She paused by the marble fountain in front of the venue, the Grand Bellevue, Spokane's most exclusive wedding estate. A venue that came with a price tag exceeding $50,000 just for the space, not including floral arrangements, music, or catering. Margaret knew this number intimately. She'd signed the contract herself. The entire wedding had cost just over $112,000. Every invoice, every vendor payment, every negotiated service had been routed through Margaret's name and bank account. Grace hadn't lifted a finger, not for the planning, not for the payments, not even for the details. Margaret hadn't expected gratitude, but she hadn't expected exile either. She sat down on the edge of the fountain, carefully adjusting her hem to hide a small tear along the seam. Around the side of the building, she noticed a familiar face. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for Margaret years ago and later for Grace after she moved out. Maria's face lit up with surprise as she rushed over. Mrs. Holloway, they didn't let you in? Margaret managed a thin smile. Apparently, I wasn't on the list. Maria's expression twisted into something bitter. After everything you did? She lowered her voice. Do you remember last year when Grace fired me? Margaret turned to her, brows furrowing. You never told me why. Maria hesitated, then said, It was because I called you one night. Grace was planning the wedding and kept maxing out her cards. I called you to ask if maybe you could help her pay the deposit. She overheard, and the next day, she said I was overstepping. She let me go. Margaret blinked. You were only trying to help. I know, Maria said quietly, but in her world, help means weakness, and weakness has no place in their circles. Margaret's breath hitched, another piece of truth falling into place. Her daughter wasn't just dismissive. She had rewritten the past, brick by brick, erasing every kindness, every bridge Margaret had ever built. A soft ding from inside the venue signaled the next phase of the ceremony. Applause rippled through the glass windows. Music swelled. Margaret stood. She smoothed the front of her dress and walked toward the entrance once more, not to beg for entry, but to deliver her final word. She stopped just inside the threshold, visible to the guests, framed in the golden light of the foyer. Grace was laughing with a group of guests near the photo booth. Her dress shimmered under the lights, hand-selected by Margaret from a boutique in Seattle. $12,000, ivory silk, custom-tailored. Margaret called her name gently. Grace. The room hushed again. Heads turned. Grace blinked in surprise. Her mouth opened slightly, brows drawing together. Margaret held her gaze. You look beautiful, she said, her voice even, unwavering. In the dress your mother chose. Then she turned, walked back out through the double doors, and didn't look back. Behind her, gasps followed in whispers. Some guests began murmuring. One woman leaned into her husband and said, Wait, wasn't that the bride's mother? Another man replied, "I thought she wasn't coming. She paid for this whole thing?" The truth was leaking, first as murmurs, then as ripples through the crowd. Margaret reached her car, the old Buick she had driven for nearly a decade. She sat behind the wheel, watching through the windshield as the string quartet played on inside. Her gift sat untouched on the table, her name likely scribbled over or ignored. She didn't start the car immediately. She just sat there, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting in her lap, and let the tears come, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. Years of sacrifice had come to this moment. The door closed. The sentence, "You don't belong." And yet, something inside her shifted. She had been cast out, but she held the power. Grace had thrown away her mother for the illusion of perfection, but perfection was expensive, and Margaret held the receipts. The drive home was silent. Margaret didn't turn on the radio. She didn't cry. She gripped the wheel with steady hands, her jaw set, her heart burning not with sadness anymore, but with clarity. She pulled into her driveway at exactly 4:03 p.m. Her small white house sat quietly beneath the budding trees of late spring. Inside, everything was as she had left it. Books lined the shelves, kettle cold on the stove, the locket box still open on the kitchen table from the morning she'd wrapped Grace's gift. She didn't take off her coat. She walked straight to her home office, opened the bottom drawer of her old filing cabinet, and pulled out a neatly stacked folder marked Wedding, Grace. Inside were contracts, invoices, authorization letters, all signed by Margaret, all paid in full by her. She turned on her desk lamp, sat down, and picked up the phone. The first call went to Evergreen Bank. First National Business Services, this is Patricia speaking. How may I assist you? Hello, Patricia. This is Margaret Holloway, account 726398. I need to place immediate stop payments on several transactions dated within the last 30 days. A pause. Certainly, Mrs. Holloway. May I ask the reason for the request? There's been a breach of agreement, Margaret said. I was led to believe this event would include me. It does not. Patricia hesitated for a beat, then said gently, Understood. Let me pull up your transactions. Margaret confirmed each one. Venue rental, catering service, string quartet, floral design, photography, custom lighting, linen rental, over a dozen transactions totaling over $100,000. I'll need to verify your authorization codes for charges over $10,000, Patricia said. Margaret recited them from memory. Stop payments are now in effect, Patricia said. Would you like confirmation numbers sent via email? No need. I'm writing them down. Margaret thanked her, hung up, and dialed again. This time, Bellevue Events and Catering. Good afternoon, Bellevue. This is Marcus. Marcus, this is Margaret Holloway. You're currently serving the Holloway Andrews wedding at your facility. Yes, ma'am. It's a lovely event, running beautifully so far. It won't be for long, Margaret said evenly. The bank has frozen all authorized payments, effective immediately. Your services are no longer covered. Silence. Then the quick shuffle of papers. I'm sorry, what? I suggest you begin securing your inventory. You'll want to protect your food, your equipment, unless the couple has an alternate method of payment. I'll need to speak with the event manager. I'd recommend you hurry. She hung up before he could respond. Next, Bloom and Vine Floral Studio. Susan speaking. Susan, this is Margaret Holloway, the bride's mother. Oh yes, hello. Your arrangements look absolutely stunning. They won't for long. Payment authorizations have been revoked. You'll need to recover your assets if you want to salvage value. A stunned pause. But the orchids are integrated into the decor. You may want to send a team immediately, before dessert is served. One by one, she moved through the list. Photographer, DJ, lighting crew, linen rentals, custom cake baker. By 4:42 p.m., it was done. Margaret sat back in her chair, the faint hum of the desk lamp filling the silence. She looked at her phone. No missed calls. Not yet. She imagined the scene unfolding at the venue. Guests smiling, sipping champagne, Grace glowing in her gown, Henry likely laughing among colleagues, confident in the seamless perfection of the event. And then, confusion. The quartet stopping mid-song, the florist team dismantling centerpieces, caterers pausing, speaking in low tones. The spiral would begin slowly, an unraveling thread, unnoticeable at first. But soon too many missing details would create chaos. She didn't want revenge. This wasn't revenge. This was clarity. This was consequence. Let them learn the cost of erasure. Inside the Grand Bellevue, the unraveling had begun. At first it was subtle. A missing centerpiece here, a tablecloth being rolled up there. The guests assumed a vendor was making adjustments between the ceremony and the reception. But as the string quartet stopped mid-piece and began packing their instruments, whispers turned to frowns. Then came the catering staff. Marcus, the head of Elegant Affair Catering, walked briskly into the hall, clipboard in hand, sweat beading at his temple. He went directly to the head table, where Grace and Henry were seated beneath a floral arch. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, voice low but urgent. "We've been informed that all payments for today's services have been halted. We're contractually obligated to protect our assets. We must stop service." Grace blinked. "What do you mean, halted?" "I mean," Marcus said, holding up a printout from the bank, "that our contract is void unless immediate payment is arranged." "You're joking." "I'm not." Before Grace could reply, two assistants began covering the buffet table with white sheets. Guests looked on, baffled, as steaming dishes were wheeled away and wine bottles uncorked moments earlier were now being recorked and sealed. Then the florists arrived. Susan, flanked by two assistants, began carefully removing the orchids from each centerpiece. She moved swiftly, her demeanor professional but firm. When questioned by the wedding planner, she held up her own documentation. "Contract signed by Margaret Holloway," she said, stipulated that the event included her attendance. Clause 5B, vendor services contingent upon inclusive guest recognition of contracting party. "What does that mean?" the planner asked, pale-faced. "It means," Susan replied, "that when they told her she wasn't welcome, this entire contract became null and void." Twist 1 detonated. Henry stood up abruptly, his voice rising. "This is insane. There's no way she had that kind of power." Susan raised an eyebrow. "She paid for everything. You didn't read the fine print?" Meanwhile, Grace was already on her phone, her hands trembling as she redialed over and over. No answer, straight to voicemail. "Mom," she whispered, stepping away from the chaos. Outside, Margaret was already walking across the parking lot, her shoulders straight, her steps steady. Grace burst through the front doors, heels catching on cobblestone. "Mom, wait!" Margaret didn't stop. "Please," Grace cried, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean it like that. I was trying to protect the image. Henry's family, they—" But Margaret just kept walking. She didn't turn around, not once. Twist 2, emotional silence, the kind that echoes. Inside, the scene had devolved into murmurs, then arguments. Michael, one of Henry's law firm partners, was demanding answers. One guest took a video of the florist removing the massive centerpiece from the altar, muttering, "You don't see this every day." They posted it to TikTok. The caption, "When the bride kicks out her mom, who paid for the entire wedding." By the time the reception should have been in full swing, the video had gone viral. Within hours, it was reposted across Twitter, Instagram, Reddit. Justice served cold, like the appetizers they didn't get to eat. Imagine disinviting the person funding your fairy tale. She walked out like a queen. No drama, just consequences. Margaret Holloway is my new hero. Hashtags began trending. Mother of the wedding. Bridezilla backfires. Holloway clause. Reporters started calling the Grand Bellevue asking for statements. Vendors posted screenshots of contracts to verify their side of the story. By morning, local news stations were running a segment titled, "Spokane Socialite's Wedding Turns Sour After Hidden Clause Voids Six-Figure Event." Horn Twist 3, Public Exposure, Digital Judgment, and Internet Fury. Margaret never commented. She didn't need to. The silence that had once condemned her was now a weapon turned the other way. Grace sat alone in the bridal suite, still in her $12,000 dress, surrounded by half-packed flower arrangements and untouched gifts. Her phone vibrated relentlessly. Texts from friends. "Hey, are you okay? Did that really happen? I saw the video. It's bad. Is it true your mom paid for everything?" She didn't reply. Even Henry was quiet now, staring at his phone with clenched jaw, calculating the social fallout. His family name was being dragged online. He had invited donors, clients, legacy friends, and now they were witnessing the unraveling of not just a wedding, but a reputation. Back at home, Margaret placed all the signed contracts in a safe. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat at the window, and stared at the budding lilac tree in her backyard. She wasn't smiling, but she was no longer carrying silence on her back. The next morning, Margaret woke at 6:15 a.m., as she always did. There was no alarm clock. Her body had learned this rhythm over decades of discipline, of doing what needed to be done, even when it wasn't fair. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and walked down the narrow hallway into her office. The morning sun had just begun spilling through the lace curtains, casting warm patterns on the carpet. Margaret sat at the desk where she had signed every check, printed every receipt, documented every loan, none of which had ever been called by their name. Until now. She unlocked the bottom drawer, the one she hadn't opened since before the wedding. Inside were 5 manila envelopes, each carefully labeled: education, housing, transportation, lifestyle, and wedding. She removed them one by one, placing them across the desk like evidence in a courtroom. Then she opened them. First, education. She unfolded the tuition statements from Grace's time at Whitmore Preparatory Academy, $14,000 a year for 6 years. Then came the college expenses, $52,000 per year for 4 years at Northwestern. She flipped through pages of meal plan fees, textbook reimbursements, study abroad programs. There were signed withdrawal receipts for Grace's networking retreat in Barcelona, totaling over $7,000. Total, $287,000. Margaret wrote the number at the top of a clean legal pad. Next, housing. 3 years of dorm rent, 2 years of post-grad apartment in Chicago, subsidized fully by Margaret while Grace completed her master's degree. $2,300 per month plus utilities plus cable plus furniture. Total, $112,000. She underlined the number. Transportation came next, starting with the first used Honda Margaret bought when Grace was 16. Then the lease on the BMW Grace had needed for job interviews. Then the down payment for the SUV Grace had wanted once she got engaged, plus insurance. Total, $74,000. Lifestyle was the hardest to calculate. Spa packages, weekend trips, new laptops, yoga memberships, $300 shoes. Many of these expenses weren't tracked through invoices. Margaret had saved bank statements, though, carefully highlighted, cross-referenced. Estimated total, $170,000. And finally, wedding. She opened the folder. Inside were contracts, payment authorizations, email threads with vendors. The invoice from Bellevue Events alone was $53,000. Catering, $27,000. Florals, $11,000. Music, decor, security, coordination. Total, $147,000. When she was done, Margaret looked at the final tally, $946,000. She stared at the number for a long time, not with bitterness, not even with regret, with clarity. At 10:15 a.m., Margaret walked into a brick office building just off Main Street in downtown Spokane. The plaque outside read, Judith Bellamy and Associates, Family and Civil Law. Judith herself opened the door to the conference room, her silver hair pulled back in a braid, glasses perched on her nose. She smiled warmly. Margaret Holloway, she said. "It's been too long." Margaret returned the smile. "Only about 28 years. Judith chuckled. "Last I remember, we were drinking cheap wine in my dorm room, trying to convince each other we'd both make it in law." "One of us did," Margaret said. "One of us chose her daughter," Judith replied gently, gesturing for her to sit. They caught up briefly, old friends weaving through time like muscle memory. But soon Margaret opened her bag and placed the 5 folders on the table. "I need your help," she said. Judith put on her reading glasses and opened the first folder. Her eyes scanned the documents, contracts, statements, highlighted notes. With each turn of the page, her brows arched higher. "How long have you been tracking all this?" "Since Grace was 5. Judith closed the folder slowly. "This is meticulous." "I want to reclaim it," Margaret said. "All of it." "You mean sue your daughter?" "No," Margaret said. "Not yet. I want to reclassify it as a personal loan, a lifetime advance, no interest, but not a gift." Judith nodded. "That's doable. There's no formal loan agreement, but the documentation is strong. Pattern of financial support without reciprocal commitment. Strong argument for restitution. I want her to know what it all cost, not just the money, but the decades." Judith opened her notepad. "Then we start by sending her a formal notice. Not threatening, just professional. A detailed record of all financial support to date, labeled as a request for repayment. We give her 30 days to respond. And if she refuses, then we escalate." Margaret nodded. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want humiliation. She wanted accountability. By noon, the framework was complete. Judith would draft the letter, attach the full ledger of documented support, and send it to Grace's last known address. Certified. Signature required. The past, once buried in silence, was now a file of undeniable evidence. That night, Margaret placed the remaining copies in her home safe, alongside the locket that Grace had never opened. The truth was no longer hidden. It had become her armor. The document lay open on Judith's desk like an unread confession. Margaret stared at it for longer than she intended, her breath caught in her chest. Buried at the bottom of the venue rental agreement, on page 17, in italics, tiny font, hidden beneath boilerplate text, was a clause so cold it felt like frost across her heart. In the event that the contracting party is not permitted attendance at the contracted event, the full contract amount shall become a secured loan, payable in full by the recipient party. Grace had signed it. Margaret reread the phrase, blind to its meaning at first, then realizing the weight of its power. Grace, desperate to secure the venue, had agreed. If she denied her mother entry, she would owe her every penny back. Twist one, and it hit like a sledgehammer. Margaret felt her throat burn. The sacrifices, the erased nights, the hidden bursaries, none of it well-intentioned or forgiven. She closed the folder. "It's there," she said quietly, pointing to the clause. She signed it. Judith exhaled slowly and closed her eyes for a moment. "That changes things. We can file it as both evidence and enforceable contract." Margaret drew in a ragged breath. "Then let's do it." They worked in silence for a while, the quiet punctuated only by pages turning. Margaret felt a gentle numbness creeping through her veins. It wasn't sorrow, not exactly, but the hard edge of finality. By mid-afternoon, Judith had a revised letter, legally firm, respectful, but unapologetic. It detailed Margaret's living expenses, long-standing financial support, and the newly revealed contractual obligation. It included a clear demand, repayment of $946,000 within 30 days, or she would be forced to initiate collection proceedings, including interest, if necessary. Before sending, Margaret asked for a moment alone. She pulled out her phone and typed a message she knew would change everything. "I loved you with every way I knew how. This is how you repay me." She paused, unsure, then tapped send. Then, with a deep breath, she dialed Grace's number. The call went straight to voicemail. Margaret left a calm, controlled message. "Grace, you have 30 days. Check your documents." No tears, no plea. Then she posted everything, every spreadsheet, every receipt, the signed clause, the letter. They went live on a blog she hosted under her name. No comments enabled, just documents. She clicked publish. Within minutes, the internet erupted. Her post was shared on Reddit with the title, "A Mother's Sacrifice, a Daughter's Clause, When Love Becomes Liability." Social media lit up. Twitter, reading 28 years of receipts from a mother, heartbreaking and bold. That clause, like a slap disguised as ink. She walked away in silence, then published the truth. Wow. Facebook. I cried. That was love, not obligation. I think some of us have let people walk through us and never acknowledge it. Local forums, Spokane socialite bride, more like entitled ingrate. That mother deserves a medal, not a Petra letter. The dam had burst. Margaret watched the share counts climb, the reactions pour in. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt vindicated. Glancing up at the pendant light, she allowed herself a small exhale, hard-earned, heavy. Later that evening, Judith and she dined quietly at a small cafe across the street. Over steaming bowls of soup, they watched the local news. The anchor rattled statistics about online discussions and ethical parenthood. Judith reached across and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You did it?" she said softly. Margaret nodded. No shouting, no vengeance, just truth. Twist 2 had brought her here. Back at home, she reviewed the page view stats on her blog. Thousands of views, dozens of media inquiries, mentions, interviews. She didn't seek spotlight, but she would accept responsibility for the impact. Over the next few days, messages filtered through, some sympathetic, some outraged on Grace's behalf, some from strangers telling their own stories of unseen sacrifice. Most of them ended the same. "Thank you for saying what needed saying." On the 10th day, she received the first contact from Grace's lawyer. Margaret forwarded it to Judith. Grace was requesting an extension, a meeting, a discussion. Margaret read the message and sat still. This was it, a chance for conversation, not confrontation. She picked up her phone and typed, "I loved you with every way I knew how. This is how you repay me," and pressed send once more. It echoed in her mind as confirmation that her sacrifice was not an obligation, to be taken or forgotten, but something gravity and real, deserving acknowledgement. The rest would wait for tomorrow. Grace hadn't opened the blinds in 3 days. The suite at the Spokane Grand Hotel was cold despite the thermostat reading 73. The room was pristine, untouched, except for the growing clutter of takeout containers and unopened mail stacked by the door. Her phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another article. Entitled Bride Faces, $946,000 repayment to her mother after wedding backlash. She turned the screen face down. The silence had become unbearable. No more calls from her bridesmaids. No more cheerful texts from co-workers. Her inbox was dry except for promotions and legal notices. Group chats she once dominated had quietly gone still, her name mentioned only in muted whispers, if at all. She scrolled through her own Facebook page, photos from her engagement, vacations, brunches with friends, all liked, hearted, shared. That was before the letter, before the clause. Before the internet saw the truth Margaret had posted for the world. What stung most wasn't the judgment. It was the absence. No one came to her defense. Not one friend posted in her favor. Even her cousin Linda, who used to confide in her about everything, had unfriended her quietly. And her work email? Her boss had forwarded a formal HR message. In light of recent media attention, we recommend a leave of absence effective immediately. No one wanted to be associated with her. She was toxic. Grace pulled the hotel comforter tighter around her. The dress from the wedding was still hanging in the closet. She couldn't bring herself to look at it. What once symbolized elegance and prestige now felt like a ghost costume, a fraud masquerading as royalty. The door opened and Henry stepped in, phone still in hand, his face tight with tension. She sat up. "Where were you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked straight to the chair, dropped his keys, and sat down heavily. Grace approached him. "Say something, please." Henry finally looked up. "My parents want the engagement annulled." "What?" Her voice cracked. "They're calling it a financial deception." He spoke slowly, like someone repeating lines drilled into him. "They say I married into a scandal, that your mother tricked you into debt, or that you tricked her. Either way, they think it's poison." Grace gripped the edge of the chair. "You know it's not true. I didn't deceive anyone. I just didn't think she'd actually go public." Henry's eyes were unreadable. "You didn't think your mother, who paid for every single thing in your life, would ever hold you accountable?" "I didn't think it would come to this. She begged to come to her own daughter's wedding and you told her to go away. That was..." She paused, mouth dry. "It was complicated. Henry, you saw the crowd. Your family was there, the donors, everyone. She didn't fit in." "Didn't fit in?" he repeated. "She paid for it." The words echoed in the room like a bell tolling. Grace collapsed onto the bed. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt her. But you did." Silence. Henry stood again, pacing now. "My mother says the Anderson name is being dragged online, that donors are pulling out of our upcoming fundraiser, that lawyers are watching how we handle this." Grace looked up. "You're not blaming me. I'm telling you what's happening. You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked. Henry didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, "They want me to. They say I need to protect the family reputation." "And what do you want?" He paused by the window. "I don't know anymore." Her voice cracked. "You said you loved me." "I did." "Then fight for me." "I've been fighting against your mother's documents for a week, Grace. Every page is dated, notarized, factual. She has evidence for every dollar. There's nothing to fight." Grace stood slowly. "So that's it?" Henry turned to her. "When was the last time you thanked her?" The question landed like a blade. Grace said nothing. He picked up his suitcase, already packed. "My parents booked me a flight. I leave in 2 hours." "You're leaving me alone in all this. You left yourself alone." And with that, he walked out. The door clicked shut. The silence returned. But this time, it wasn't just empty. It was earned. Grace sat down slowly on the carpet. She looked at her phone, her wedding ring, the unopened legal notice from Judith Bellamy and Associates. Her whole world had shrunk to this room and the consequences within it. She opened the letter, read every line, every itemized cost, every clause. At the bottom, Margaret's signature. And beneath it, a single sentence. "This isn't revenge, it's recognition." Grace pressed her forehead to her knees and began to cry. There were no more defenses, no more justifications, only a cold, clear understanding. She had nothing left but the debt of love unreturned. The hotel room felt like a tomb. Grace sat motionless on the floor, her eyes swollen, the silence pressing down like concrete. Her phone lay beside her, no new notifications, no missed calls, only the echo of Henry's final words lingering in the air. She didn't know how long she'd sat there when her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from Henry. "Before I go, you deserve the truth." Her chest tightened. She tapped to open the message. "I didn't marry you for love. I thought I could grow to love you, maybe. But the truth is, I was after your mother's backing. We assumed she had assets, that she would fund our expansion plans after the wedding." Grace stared at the words, reread them. Her hands trembled. "My parents thought marrying into your family meant buying into long-term wealth. I pushed for the engagement because I believed your mother was the real key. I didn't realize you two were disconnected." Disconnected. Grace felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. He hadn't loved her. He had studied her, calculated her. She was a means to an end, a bridge to her mother's bank account. Her breath caught in her throat, and she had walked into it willingly. Worse, she'd shut the door on the one person who had given her everything in exchange for someone who'd only ever wanted access. And now even he had walked away. Her knees buckled and she folded into herself, shaking. After what felt like hours, she stood. On autopilot, she opened her laptop and pulled up the venue's original rental agreement. She scrolled past the contract lines, her eyes tracing the fine print, until she reached the last page. It was there again. The clause. That line she had dismissed as legal fluff. If the contracting party is denied access to the event, all costs become a personal loan enforceable upon the recipient. She had signed it, eyes wide open, or maybe just willfully closed. Grace leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Her entire life had been built on the illusion of deserving more, without ever asking who paid for it. The thought struck her, sudden and sharp. What if this wasn't just about the wedding? She opened her email app, searched for keywords she'd ignored before: property, investment, trust fund. And then she found it. A forwarded email from 6 months ago, back when they were planning the wedding. Subject: postpone the house for now, wedding priority. From Margaret Holloway. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Judith, please pause the home purchase. The wedding is coming sooner than expected, and Grace wants something special. I can liquidate the retirement investment for now. We'll find another way later. Another way. There was no other way. Grace froze. The house. The little bungalow Margaret had planned for them to live in together after retirement. Their safe place. Their forever space. Gone. So she could wear imported lace. So she could sip champagne while Margaret sat outside, uninvited. The sob caught in her throat like a scream that couldn't find air. She pulled her phone and dialed the only number that mattered. It rang once, twice, then voicemail. Beep. Mom. Her voice cracked immediately. I don't know what to say. Silence filled the space between her words. I didn't know. I didn't know about Henry. I didn't know about the house. I didn't know about the clause. I didn't know anything because I never asked. She inhaled a jagged breath. I thought I was building a life, but I was just consuming one you already built. The tears came faster now. I don't have anything left. He's gone. Everyone's gone. All I have is what you gave me, and I never even said thank you. She choked out the words. I'm so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know. I see it now, all of it, and I don't know how I'll ever make it right. She ended the call. The room remained still, heavy. Her reflection in the darkened window looked like a stranger, pale, broken, alone. No more defenses, no more illusions, just the collapse. And for the first time in 28 years, Grace Holloway felt what it meant to lose everything, except the truth. The soft glow of dusk streamed through the blinds in Margaret's home office as her phone buzzed. Every ring felt heavy with history. She pressed the green button, heart steady, voice calm. Margaret Holloway speaking. Mom, Grace's voice came, fragile, ragged. It's me. Margaret's fingers tightened briefly around the receiver. She took a slow breath, then exhaled with quiet resolve. Grace. Silence stretched between them, a cavern carved by regret. Mom, can we please talk? Margaret turned away from the patterned curtains that framed her aging house. Her expression softened, not tender, but open. I've been reviewing everything, Grace continued, voice trembling. I can't undo what happened, but I want to try. Margaret swallowed. You know, I won't just pick up the pieces. I understand, Grace said, apology heavy in her tone. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, but maybe we can start over. Margaret paused. Her world had crumbled behind her, and now this moment felt like thin ice, fragile and perilous. "What do you propose?" she asked quietly. Grace inhaled. I'll work. I'll pay rent here at home. I'll get a job, any job. I don't know where to begin, but I'll figure it out." Margaret's heart pulsed. This was the moment she'd waited for or dreaded for years. Her daughter, willing to rebuild not just financially, but emotionally, starting from zero. "You had everything handed to you," Margaret said softly. "For 28 years, you never questioned where things came from. You never asked if supporting you meant sacrificing my future." "I know," Grace whispered. "I know that now." Margaret's tone was even, resolute. "If you want to be part of my life again, you have to show you can support your own. Live independently, earn your keep for 6 months. Then we'll talk about the rest." Grace sniffed audibly. 6 months? That's fair. That's the grace period, Margaret said gently, emphasizing the irony. "Exactly 6 months. Can you do that?" Grace's voice cracked with pain and hope. "Yes, I will, I promise." Margaret hung up without further words. She stared at her hand, then typed a note in her ledger. "Grant Grace, 6 months of independent living. Conditions: full-time work, no financial support, weekly updates." Then she set the pencil down and exhaled. Days later, Grace moved into a small rental apartment a few blocks from Margaret's house. The living room was sparsely furnished: concrete gray couch, IKEA coffee table, stacks of dishes in the sink, but it was hers. Grace found a job as a barista at a local cafe. It paid just enough for rent and groceries. The first paycheck was $800. She used it to buy basic groceries and a bus pass. The rest she transferred to Margaret as her first voluntary loan repayment. Margaret watched her daughter's bank notifications. Small, earnest transfers accumulate over months. They began weekly calls on Sundays. First, grudging nods to updates. Rent paid, boss friendly, last week number of shifts, 24. Then dinners together on Fridays. Quiet at first, then stories. Grace's clumsiness behind the espresso machine. Margaret's old co-workers calling her to ask how she was. Grace started sending Margaret photos of her new home. A potted plant by the window. A bookshelf she'd assembled from used parts. A mug with faded sunflower prints that reminded her of their old kitchen. Margaret would look at them and feel something she thought she'd lost: pride. By month 4, Grace's savings began to look real. She enrolled in evening classes for accounting. "To understand what I never asked," she said. She began including Margaret in small decisions. "Do you think I should text the landlord about a leak? Should I go part-time at the cafe so I can study?" Margaret found herself responding, not with criticism, but guidance. Offering budgeting tips, gracious with reminders like, "Don't skip meals to study." They built a new rhythm, mother and daughter, not patron and dependent. On the last day of month 6, Grace knocked at Margaret's door holding a letter. The envelope read, "Final report, beginning again." Margaret opened it to find a handwritten summary. Months lived independently, expenses paid, payments made, reflections on what she'd learned. At the bottom, "I earned this, but I still want you in my life." Margaret closed the gap and pulled Grace into a hug, soft, healing. Inside, maroon walls held framed photos. One of Grace at 5, one at 18, and now one of them together again. The lines of sacrifice and forgiveness blurred. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand and whispered, "Welcome back." Grace looked up, tears in her eyes, and finally said the words Margaret had longed to hear. "Thank you." They sat side by side, not as indebted parties, but as a mother and daughter beginning again, on equal ground with honesty, respect, and open hearts. Night settled softly over Spokane, and in her small rented room, Grace sat on the edge of her bed under the faint glow of a desk lamp. Her employer had given her a small featherstone to keep behind the counter for extra cash, her first tip that day. She placed it next to a stack of returned paperbacks and dusty hardcover volumes from a local bookstore where she was now working. The smell of aged paper and polished wood surrounded her, a comforting scent, steady and real. It had begun a month ago. She'd applied for a job at Willow and Row Bookshop after seeing the Help Wanted sign. The shopkeeper, Mr. Ellison, was a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses. He saw something in Grace's nervous smile, someone seeking grounding more than direction. "I can learn quick," she'd whispered. "Quiet learners are treasures," he'd replied. And here she was, flipping through dust jackets, stamping due dates, watering potted ferns near the windowsill, and valuing each small task as a step in rebuilding herself. Grace's rent was a modest $600 a month for a second-floor room in a converted Craftsman. The landlord's daughter, a college student, lived downstairs and sometimes left her cookies. Money was tight, but this life felt honest. Every pay stub Grace opened and displayed on her nightstand made her heart flutter with something she hadn't felt in years: responsibility. One evening around 9 o'clock, she received a padded mail envelope with no return address. Inside was the worn, leather-bound notebook she recognized immediately, the one Margaret had kept in her office drawer, labeled Records, Margaret and Grace. Grace opened it with trembling fingers, dusting off the letter pressed inside. Page after page revealed meticulous entries: years of tuition, rent, car payments, groceries, dental bills, winter coats, school trips, handwritten dates, categories, amounts. She traced the ink with her fingertip with reverence, feeling each sacrifice laid out chronologically, quantified but deeply human. It wasn't just numbers, it was love in ink. Then she turned to the last page. There, in Margaret's neat script, was a note. "My darling Grace, if you still believe in me, read every line. I loved you in every way I knew how. If you still love me, read on, because this story is ours." Grace's breath caught in a sob. Here was the final twist. Knowing she'd noticed, even after everything that had been broken, her mother still offered a path back. That night, Grace could do nothing but crumble and cry. She felt the weight of regret and gratitude intertwine until they were indistinguishable. At 2 a.m., she sat at her desk, the notebook open beside a fresh sheet of stationery. She began to write. "Mom, I read." Tears blurred the ink as she wrote line after line. "I saw every entry, every cent you spent, every quiet dollar so I could be hygienically dressed for school plays, safely driven to lessons, healthy when I didn't know health mattered. I read your sacrifices when I was too young to understand budgets, and now I understand them too well. I'm sorry for giving you nothing back but silence. I'm sorry for making you repay kindness with debt letters. I don't deserve a second chance, but if you'll have me, I want to become someone worthy of reading your story. With love, not entitlement." She folded the letter carefully, stained by tears, and placed it with the notebook. In the morning, she mailed the letter, paused, inhaled, then pressed the button. Weeks passed. Grace continued to work, save, study. She relisted her small apartment. The ferns behind the counter at the bookstore thrived under her care. The routine grounded her. One Sunday afternoon, she found herself walking past Margaret's house, bushes in bloom. She reached the front porch and saw an envelope tucked in the mailbox. Inside was another letter. "Dear Grace, I have read your words, and I forgive you. The path forward won't be simple, but I want us to rebuild, together, but not as we were before. This is our new beginning. I love you, always. Mom." Grace stood on the porch, clutching the letter, unaware of how long she'd been crying. It wasn't a happy ending, not yet. It was something better, a fragile promise of renewal. She placed the letter in her bag, drew a breath of spring air, and walked away, alone but hopeful. The bookstore bell tinkled when she returned, a sound like possibility.